Good day. Thank you very much for having me as a keynote speaker for ChaosCon Africa. My name is Brian Proffitt. I am a senior manager of the community outreach team within Red Hat's open source program office. And I'm delighted to be speaking to you today about a topic that we focus very much on at Red Hat, and that is determining the business value of open source. And we'll go over what that means in this presentation, but basically it's going to be how do we combine the metrics that we're doing now and focusing on community health with what businesses want and need to know about participating in open source. And we all know that there's grand value in open source communities, and no one present here needs to hear that. But it is important that businesses can be somewhat hesitant about jumping into open source communication or participation rather, even if they believe that it is of value to them. But if they don't see it on paper, if they don't see a real business value add, they might actually pull back from full participation in open source. So before we get into what we at Red Hat and other businesses are looking at in terms of what kind of value they're looking at, I want to make sure we level set because there's going to be some terms that I'm going to be using during the presentation today that may not be universally known. So we'll just walk through that real quick and talk about what we mean by community and what we're focusing on today. So the first thing is a couple of terms that we use quite a bit at Red Hat. They are used in some parts of the open source community, and that is upstream and downstream. And basically what that means is that at Red Hat, we separate the focuses of what we do in terms of an upstream project versus a downstream product. And it's based on the metaphor of a river or a stream. And the closer you are to the source of that stream, the more closer you are to the actual source of the project that you're working at. So, for example, at Red Hat Enterprise Linux is downstream of CentOS Stream, which in turn is downstream of Fedora. And Fedora is downstream of the many upstream projects that flow into Fedora. So it's the vast upstream from which Fedora takes its projects from and builds its individual components. That goes into Fedora, which is the upstream of CentOS Stream, which is the upstream of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So this is what we mean. The upstream is the open source community-driven projects. They are typically multi-organizational. If they have commercial involvement at all, they can be individual developers, they can be foundations, they can be lots of different entities. But that is what we refer to when we talk about the upstream. And then again, the downstream is also open source. It's not proprietary, but it's more commercially driven, and it tends to be mono-organizational. There are exceptions to that through direct partnerships and things like that, but usually when you get to the point of a commercial project, it's usually one organization that's driving that, but not always. Now, when we're talking about value today, I want to give a word about licenses, and that word is actually no. We're not going to be talking about licenses, not in this conversation. Licenses are important, but they don't really apply to the kinds of value that we're talking about. And actually, this is why we see a lot of confusion right now in the business arena, because there are new businesses that have started up that believe that open source is a business proposition. It is not. It is a developer model and a developer methodology. So licenses are here to set up the rules of the road for the community. How are contributions accepted? How are things distributed? But they don't change the value equation. They're completely separate. So Other terms that I'm going to be using will be, if I do mention anything about this, and I tend to use these terms interchangeably, there is free software. These are projects that are licensed with what we know as restrictive licenses that basically require that any changes you make to software, and if you distribute that software, those changes have to be shared upstream and with everybody else who gets that software. Licenses like that include like the GNU General Public License and the LGPL. Then we refer to open source software. These are permissive licenses. Changes can stay or go as desired. You don't have to push your changes out to the rest of the world if you don't want to. And licenses in that genre include the Apache Public License and the MIT license, the BSD license, and so on. So this is what if I use these terms, this is what we're talking about. But again, licenses aren't necessarily really a part of this discussion about value. So what are the values that businesses are looking at if it's not about how things are licensed or whatnot? So in this section, I'm going to examine different areas of businesses and what they look for when they look at any kind of project and determine its value. And these are values beyond the obvious, like sales revenue. That's a pretty much low-hanging fruit. But there are other values that businesses are looking for when they're figuring out if they want to take something on and deciding whether or not to do something. So sales value. One of the common misconceptions for businesses is that if you are in the business of working with upstream communities, which are typically free of charge and can be downloaded and used at any point, and they are functional enough that they can actually do more or do as much, as the actual commercial project, you will have people inside a company, even inside of Red Hat, who will be against promoting upstream projects and working with them because they will say, hey, you're taking sales away from me because everybody's using the free version and not the version that I'm trying to sell. This proposition actually is an error because at Red Hat, we're actually not selling the software. We're selling the value of our expertise so we can support and deliver other services to customers. And this is why upstream should not be regarded as something that is an obstacle for actual sales revenue. We don't lose downstream sales to upstream use. That is the problem, that is the perception, but it is simply not true. And some ways to sort of mitigate this and make that perception go away is you can establish better handoffs between what's going on in the upstream and the downstream. You want to make sure that your development team is working in the upstream as much as possible, only working in downstream when they have to, and making sure that that direction is a one-way street and that process is clear and transparent so everybody understands what's going on. Yes, occasionally there will be an emergency bug fix that will have to be prioritized for a downstream commercial project or product rather, and backported to the upstream. But that should be rare. That should not be a common event. That's really only in use of emergencies. So when we talk about that, other things that we're doing is you want to have your community and your company become thought leaders in community events. Again, if people recognize your company or your organization as having value and having knowledge about a particular technology, that's going to eventually translate well for you when you're talking to potential customers moving forward. You also have the chance to engage users earlier. I want to be careful here, and I'll go into this later in the presentation. You don't want to treat community users as potential customers. but it also doesn't really hurt to know what they need, who they are, and understand what the community is really trying to build so that you understand the product that you're trying to sell later. And also too, and again, this is one you have to be careful with, but your community will also serve as an ad hoc research and development department. For Fedora, for instance, there are a lot of things in Fedora that will not show up in RHEL because they are very cutting edge. People are giving something a try. They're doing it with deliberation, but they're also throwing things out there to the general public and users that, let's see if this works. Let's see if there's value. Let's see if people want to use this. Let's see if it's stable and it doesn't break anything. There's a whole bunch of things that are going on in Fedora. And for those of us who use Fedora or Ubuntu or Arch or any of the other distributions like that, users expect some things to not work as well sometimes, but for the most part, we like being on the cutting edge because we're seeing our value is coming from experimenting with and talking and using rather the latest and greatest version of the software. Okay. Another kind of value that we can talk about is marketing value. And marketing value is even more soft and harder to define than sales value. Because again, sales value eventually will equate to, I sold this much, I made this much money, it's on my balance sheet. Marketing value has always been more of a soft proposition, even within the hallways of businesses. The problem is, typically, when we're working with marketing folks in Red Hat and our customers and our partners, they tend to sort of mix up where the messaging should be in terms of upstream versus downstream. And when they mix it like that, it can create real problems. So one of the things you want to do is simplify your branding. At Red Hat, for the most part, our upstream projects have different names from our downstream products, which sounds like a simple, obvious thing, but there are times when the upstream and the downstream have the same name, Ansible, and you have to be clear about differentiating, okay, where's the work being done? If I say I've applied a bug fix to Ansible, well, probably the upstream, but did I? It becomes kind of confusing. And so you want to simplify the branding by keeping things separate. You want to gather customer issues, make sure that you've applied their issues, but not in the downstream. You want to apply those in the upstream. It becomes very important. A lot of companies will, to more quickly satisfy a customer's needs, they will push a change into the downstream and maybe backport it up to the upstream later, if we're lucky. Even if they do that, that's still not the best way of doing it. You should only be backporting when you have a critical bug fix or a day zero exploit, something that really defines an emergency, not just because a customer wants it. So you want to make sure that your marketing team is talking to customers, knowing what they want, and making sure there's a pipeline to the development team in the upstream that gets things done there. You want to find out about case stories. And this is something that I used to do when I was the community manager of the Overt community. It's no longer a Red Hat project. It's actually been given out to the broader community. But when we were stewarding Overt, we did a lot of case studies about Overt, not the actual downstream Red Hat virtualization platform, but Overt, because we wanted to highlight that this software was good enough to take on production level events, and therefore it would kind of by default make that kind of claim for the downstream product. But it also showed the value of what people could get from upstream, and realize that get past the old misperception that open source projects are somehow amateur or broken, and they're not. You want to make sure that your marketing team is working with the development team and establishing feature roadmaps and also advertising those. So if an upstream is building feature roadmaps, downstream customers, existing customers, and potential customers, they have a clear window into what's coming. It's not like a proprietary software company where people have to wait and see, whoa, what new feature will be released tomorrow or next week or next year. If you're paying attention and if your marketing team is good, they will actually be able to get customers to look at the upstream, hopefully even participate, but even just looking at it and saying, oh, I see what's coming down the line, I will be able to prepare my applications and my systems for these new features that are coming. So that gives value to the customer very directly there. Okay, when we're talking about business value, there are some things you really should not do. And I alluded to some of these earlier. Your community is a valuable asset, but for whatever you do's sake, do not treat them as a lead resource. Time and time again, even within Red Hat, we have new sales and marketing people who come in. They're very excited. They want to, make all the money. I get that. But then they also turn around and they do things that might not be healthy for a community. And one of those is going in and, soliciting sales to existing community members. That is typically not something you should be doing. You don't want to track software user data. There are privacy issues in multiple countries that actually define that as unwanted behavior and sometimes even illegal behavior. And also, too, it's just generally not a good practice to do. If you start spying on your users and figuring out what they're going to do without their permission, you do end up alienating your customer base. There are times when telemetry is useful and done with permission, so everybody is exactly clear what data is being gathered and why and how it will be used. Those are good things. But if it's being used to generate potential sales, it's typically not well regarded within open source communities, and that behavior will not be rewarded. You definitely don't want to show up at community events and make a hard pitch for a product. I never will sell you or try to sell you anything that Red Hat makes. That's not my job, for one, and for another, if I did that, that would be tasteless and ridiculous in talking to a group like you today. So that is not something your company should be doing. Don't ignore community contributions. Sometimes you're going to get some new feature or new bug fix that's not going to come from one of your company's associates. You want to recognize those, you want to use them, bring them in, and you want to make sure that recognition is given for that community user. Open source is not about which company is doing the best job. Open source is about which community member is participating the most or has the best idea. We all like recognition. We all like to be rewarded for our work. That is a way to do it. So don't alienate your community by pushing out or ignoring community contributions. What are some things you can do? I went over the whole, well, these are bad behaviors. What are some good behaviors? You want to always maintain a positive focus on the upstream community. That will always reward you. It is not easy. It is slow. And this is one of the problems that businesses have with open source. They don't necessarily see the rewards right away. But if you keep at it and build the trust and do the positive things, you will eventually be rewarded in terms of financial growth. You can, I've said that you should not be mining your community for data on potential sales. You can, though, look at people who respond to newsletters, people who talk to you at events, and those are what we call soft leads. So if someone comes to me and I'm at an event like Scale or Open Source Summit, and they ask me about a product, I'm not going to be able to tell them much about anything because I'm not in sales. I'm not a product engineer. However, I can take their data and I can hand it off to other people. So there are opportunities for communication. It's just that you don't want to be the one that's data mining that information, but you should be there to talk to people. And you can softly connect people to the right kind of sales and marketing folks and maybe generate sales. That's okay as long as it's initiated by the community member. You can, and this is something we've been doing at Red Hat for a while, we do track sales that have come from an upstream user. So even though we're not actively seeking to engage those upstream users and bringing them in, when somebody, for instance, came over from the overt community and actually purchased support for Red Hat virtualization, the downstream product, we would mark that. And we would indicate that, okay, we didn't do this, we didn't actively pull this in, but this is a clear win from the community. And tracking those kind of metrics do enable people to see the value of the community, even though it's a very passive process and we're not supposed to go out there and recruit people. When they do come in on their own, that's a win to be noted. And then again, repeating something I said earlier, you work with community contributions, you build partnerships, you build new features, you engage people in the community, you're improving your product, but you're also building relationships that should eventually turn into some kind of financial benefit for your company. Okay, so beyond the soft value of the businesses in sales and marketing, and these are things that can be difficult to track, are there ways to track the ROI on paper for an open source community? And it turns out there are. And there are some ways that we are doing this at Red Hat. Some of them we're doing now, and some of them we're experimenting with. And as I go through this next section, I will define what we're doing and what we want to do very clearly. So the mystery of return on investment, ROI, it's always been very difficult because when you're participating in a community, you're usually spending money on events, you're spending money on infrastructure, you've got in-house developers that are working out in the community, so you're spending money on their salaries, travel, whatever they need to get the job done. But you don't always necessarily see what are you getting back in terms of actual dollar amounts. And again, we talked about the sales value and the marketing value, but those are usually softer things to measure. There are some things you can do. You can basically, a straightforward way of doing this is say, okay, if I have a piece of software and I know that I'm distributing this and I'm, even freely in the open source community, if there is an equivalent software out there that a competitor is doing, and it's proprietary, but I'm aware of their sales, either through published sales numbers or educated guess, I can make a quick one-to-one assumption and say, okay, if my software application that does this and is the same as this proprietary application that does basically the same thing, and I know they're making this much money a year, then I can say, well, that's the equivalent value that I'm delivering to my customers. And then I can also say, and I'm doing that at this cost, and this is my actual profit versus cost versus revenue generated. That's a straightforward equivalency model. It's okay to use that for very specialized applications, but for somebody like Red Hat, where we make a platform, well, okay, we make a platform, it's an operating system eventually that works just like Macs and Windows. So do we do the equivalency model there? Not really, because, you know, our software tends to run on servers. It doesn't run on desktops very often. So it's not really a desktop operating system. So the equivalency model fails. So you can do this in some specialized instances, but not always. Another way of doing this is something that even the Linux Foundation, which is, you know, obviously Chaos's project, or I'm sorry, parent foundation, we used to do this, and I was actually involved in some of these. You can actually look at, you know, software lines of code, and you can generate the cost of building that code as if you were paying developers in an equivalent model. And then you can factor that against the revenue that you do generate it, and then you can figure out, okay, what's the value of the software? The most difficult thing to qualify and quantify, rather, is the value of creativity. We constantly recognize that one of the best values of open source is the creativity value. If I'm working with people in other nations, coming from other cultures and coming from other companies, different educational systems that, you know, train these people up, you know, I'm going to just almost automatically get a form of creativity and new ideas and new ways of thinking that I would not have gotten if I were working by myself or if I were working even inside my own company. Cultures and companies tend to homogenize and make things similar when they go through and build things together. But diverse open source communities, you don't see that as much. And so you get the value of creativity. That is probably the hardest thing to measure when we're talking about the ROI of open source. The person hours example, this is again something that I was involved with long ago when I was with the Linux Foundation, when we would do measurements of the value of the Linux kernel. And that basically is number of lines of code times the hourly salary. You divide it by the time it takes to develop, and then you get a rough idea of how much would it cost to recreate that software. You can then factor in actual costs. What are you paying for servers? What are you paying for staff? And actually paying associates who are involved in an upstream community. And then you will get your revenue, and you can basically just take roughly the actual costs minus creation value, and then plus revenue, and that gets you your ROI. These are things that we are experimenting with, especially that last ROI formula, because there are nuances there that aren't applicable to every single community. This is a very straightforward reduction of what might look like, ROI might look like. And it's something we're experimenting with now at Red Hat. And again, I should emphasize that we're not experimenting with this at Red Hat because we want to do something else. We are always going to do open source. But even if you're always going to drive the same kind of car or ride the same kind of bicycle or ride the same kind of motorcycle, that's the machine you love. It doesn't hurt to understand how that machine works. And it doesn't hurt to make sure that that machine is running in optimal capacity. Red Hat will always be an open source business. That's what we do. But we can do it better, and we can do it more efficiently. And by doing it more efficiently, we can scale better and then actually make a broader impact on the open source ecosystem better. And beyond the code, there are other things that can be measured on paper. Documentation, better documentation. You know what you're spending on building the documentation. You know it will lead to usually less support costs, so you can factor that in. The more people who rely on the documentation perhaps are the less people who are contacting your support staff. and then you made that more efficient. Getting bug fixes and security fixes out earlier in the upstream will also reduce support costs for your downstream product, and it will also improve customer retention. The earlier those fixes are out there and are seen, the better your customers are going to feel that you are taking care of the software that they rely on. So what can Chaos do? What are things that we in the Chaos community can do? Because I've talked a lot about what Red Hat is doing around determining business value, and that's not necessarily related to, at least at first glance, the community value that we're trying to drive. We're trying to look at community health and sustainability and risk factors, and these are all very, very important and vital metrics. And they don't seem like they relate to business. And I would submit that maybe there is a future for Chaos to start delving into this a little bit more. I do not want us to become a business-focused organization, but I do think that there is value for us to pay attention to business-related metrics because it's a two-way street. The business is open source is not just about one thing. It's not just about the health of the community, because a community's health also can depend on the health of the company that's stewarding that community or companies that are stewarding that community. So it's important to realize that it's a two-way street. So things that we can do, there are no business metrics out there. Businesses love to measure things. They love to get all this information and figure out how they're doing. Are there metrics that they have that we can borrow and factor into community health? Because again, communities are built of individuals. They're built of nonprofit foundations and organizations that steward, and they are also comprised of businesses and companies that are trying to actually make money off of this. Some businesses are doing this better than others. How do we measure participation on how good a business is doing in a community? And if they are a good citizen, how well are they doing? Because if they're a great citizen and we want them around, but they're not getting real business value, then we run the risk of, well, they might change their mind, they might change their license, they might stop participating in the open source community, and that would not be great. So what can we do to anticipate that? We should be emphasizing diversity no matter what. All diversity is good, whether we're talking about gender, race, corporations, geolocations. Again, the more people that are involved and the more differences they have in terms of how they approach problem solving and innovation, the better any open source project will be. And I think Chaos should be focusing on those metrics, and they do a great job of that now. And I think we should continue to do that and expand that in any way possible moving forward. And finally, again, we need to figure out how to communicate this to businesses and not just talk about a community's health, but if we can figure out ways to talk about the value of a community. They should be doing a good chunk of this work because they want to understand how the business works. But I think Chaos can be a partner for them moving forward to determine, what is the value of an open source community to the organizations that are involved in it. It's not about bragging. It's not about competition. It's about making sure that people are still paying attention to open source. We have seen repeatedly in the last few years, businesses get very excited about being an open source company. They don't think through how they're going to actually generate revenue. They get disappointed when the revenue isn't coming in or not coming in fast enough. And then they change the way they do business. They change their license to something that is not open source and is source available. They did not know what they were getting into. or they assume that if I make it, if they make it open source, magical things happen and they will automatically make money. It's not true. Making money is hard. It's a hard thing to do. If it were easy, we'd all be rich. So you have to think about it. And Chaos has a unique perspective because we're working with these communities all the time to help educate and inform existing businesses and new businesses that are coming into open source projects and say, hey, this is what you're getting into. So it's a hugely exciting time for open source. It really is. We have basically started to run the world. And the use of open source and communities all over the world and nationalities is going to be a real godsend. We're working with organizations now like the United Nations and other governmental organizations throughout Africa to implement open source solutions for populations where technology has not caught on or has been harder to deploy. But now everybody has a chance to get in on the game. They have a chance to build something, and we can all build that together. And getting businesses involved and other organizations is a good step forward to doing that, and helping businesses understand how open source communities work should be, I believe, something that Chaos should focus on. And with that, I thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I hope that all of you have a lovely conference there this year. I am so sorry that I was unable to attend. And I look forward to getting questions from you all and following up and having conversations about this through the remainder of the year. Thank you so much and have an excellent day.